At dinner, my sister showed off her shopping spree. "Oh, and I bought a car too," she smirked. My parents praised her, but when I stood up and spoke, their faces turned pale. When my sister smugly announced her shopping spree and casually dropped, "Oh, and I bought a car too," my parents cheered like she had just discovered the cure for cancer. Their eyes sparkled with admiration, their voices gushing with praise. "Wow, sweetie, you really deserve it!" My mother beamed, clasping her hands together. My father nodded approvingly. "A well-earned reward for all your hard work." Hard work? I almost laughed out loud. My sister, Melissa, had never worked a real job a day in her life. But thanks to our parents' unwavering favoritism, she never needed to. They had always treated her like royalty, showering her with gifts, funding her every whim, and bending over backward to make sure she never experienced the inconvenience of responsibility. And me? Well, I was the afterthought. The son they never invested in because I wasn't as special as their golden girl. I let them have their little celebration, sitting quietly at the far end of the dining table. My fingers traced the rim of my glass as I took a slow sip of water, keeping my expression neutral. Melissa grinned, twirling a loose strand of her perfect, salon-styled hair. "It's a black convertible. Top of the line. Custom leather seats, premium sound system, and oh! The guy at the dealership said I was a natural negotiator. Can you believe it?" I could. Because she hadn't been negotiating with her own money. I glanced at my mother, wondering if she would even attempt to explain where all this money had come from. But of course she didn't. Instead, she looked at me, finally acknowledging my presence. "You should be more like your sister, Daniel. She knows how to enjoy life." That was it. That was the moment. I set my glass down, smoothed out my shirt, and stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate. A pin could have dropped in the silence that followed. Then, in a calm, steady voice, I spoke. And their world turned upside down. Melissa raised an eyebrow at me, her smirk unwavering. My mother looked confused. My father exhaled sharply, as if bracing himself for one of my outbursts. I wasn't going to give them one. Not tonight. I placed my napkin neatly beside my plate and met Melissa's gaze. "That car you just bought," I said evenly. "Did you even check where the money came from?" Her smirk faltered, just slightly. "What do you mean?" I turned to my parents. "You never told her, did you?" I let out a humorless chuckle. "Of course not. That would mean admitting what you did." My mother shifted uncomfortably. My father tightened his grip on his fork. Melissa rolled her eyes. "Daniel, what are you even talking about?" I leaned forward slightly, keeping my voice calm, steady. "Melissa, the money you used? The money they'd been giving you for years? It wasn't theirs to give. It was mine." The air in the dining room seemed to thicken. Melissa frowned. "What?" I let the words sink in before I continued. "Every family resource, every extra dime, every inheritance, they funneled it straight to you. My share? Gone. Wiped out. The business? Signed over to you. The house? Your name's on the deed. My savings, the investments I was supposed to receive? They drained them without so much as a phone call." My father slammed his fork onto his plate. "That's enough," he barked, but there was something else beneath his anger. Panic. Melissa laughed, though it was thinner now. "You're being dramatic." I didn't blink. "Check the accounts." For the first time in her life, my sister looked unsure of herself. She reached for her phone, fingers moving quickly as she pulled up her banking app. I watched her scroll, the color slowly draining from her face. My mother was the first to break. "Daniel, sweetheart, we had to do it. Your sister needed stability. She needed support." I cut her off. "And I didn't?" She faltered, but before she could speak, Melissa let out a sharp breath. "What the hell?" She shot a look at our parents. "Why are my accounts frozen?" My father stiffened. My mother reached for her glass of wine, her hand trembling. I let the silence stretch before I answered. "Because they weren't your accounts." Melissa's head snapped back to me. "What did you do?" I smiled. I did what none of you ever expected me to do. I picked up my coat, draped it over my arm, and straightened my tie. I played the long game. Her jaw clenched. What does that mean? I glanced at my parents, then back at her. It means everything you took? Everything you thought you owned? I exhaled, slow and steady. It's mine now. The room fell into a stunned, suffocating silence. And I wasn't finished yet. Melissa gripped her phone tighter, her fingers shaking. You're lying. I tilted my head. Am I? My father stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Daniel, I don't know what game you think you're playing, but you can't just take what isn't yours. I met his gaze, unwavering. That's rich, coming from you. He flinched. I turned back to Melissa. You might want to call the dealership. That car you just bought? The payment won't go through. Melissa's face twisted in confusion before she frantically tapped on her screen. A few seconds passed. Then, with a sharp intake of breath, she looked up. It declined, she whispered. I smiled. And that was just the beginning. Melissa stared at her phone like she could will it to change reality. Then she turned to our parents, her voice rising. Fix this. Either of them moved. My mother opened her mouth, then closed it again, her hands gripping the tablecloth. My father's face was set like stone, his jaw twitching. I slid my hands into my pockets and took a slow breath. You still don't get it, do you? My voice was quiet, but it carried through the tense silence. There's nothing left for them to fix. Melissa's hands curled into fists. You think you can just steal from me? I laughed, shaking my head. Steal from you? That's ironic. Because for years, I watched our parents pour everything into you, my share, my opportunities, my inheritance, while I was left with nothing. I had to fight for every step forward, while you had everything handed to you. My mother finally found her voice. We did what was best for both of you. No, I said sharply, my eyes locking onto hers. You did what was best for her. She flinched like I had struck her. Melissa scoffed. Oh, get over yourself, Daniel. You act like you're some kind of victim. She gestured wildly. Look at you, you're fine. You have a job, a place to live, what are you even complaining about? I took a step closer, my voice steady. I worked for everything I have. You've never earned a single thing in your life. And now? I let my words sink in before delivering the final blow. Now you'll finally know what it feels like to have nothing. Her face turned pale. My father slammed a hand onto the table. You had no right to do this. I leaned forward slightly. And you had no right to take everything from me. But the difference is, I exhaled, calm and composed. I made sure you won't get the chance to do it again. The weight of my words settled over them like a storm cloud. Melissa's breathing was uneven. My mother looked like she was on the verge of tears. My father clenched his fists, but there was nothing left for him to say. I had won. And they knew it. Melissa shook her head, her voice unsteady. This is insane. You can't just take everything. I exhaled slowly. I didn't take anything, Melissa. I just took back what was mine. My father pointed a shaking finger at me. You ungrateful little. I held up a hand, cutting him off. Don't. My voice was calm, but firm. Don't lecture me about gratitude. Not after everything you did. He seethed, but I wasn't finished. The business? I continued, looking directly at him. You signed it over to Melissa, thinking I wouldn't notice the fine print in the legal filings. I tilted my head. You should have read the contract before signing it. Because the moment the ink dried, the controlling shares transferred to me. His face turned pale. I turned to my mother. The house? I let out a small chuckle. You might want to check the deed. Because last year, when you needed my help to handle the paperwork, I made sure my name went where it should have been all along. Her breath hitched. Daniel, I held up a hand. And the accounts? The ones you used to fund every single reckless thing Melissa ever wanted? I took out my phone, tapped the screen a few times, and turned it around. They're frozen. Melissa lunged forward like she wanted to grab the phone from my hands, but I pulled it back before she could. No. No, 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 fix this. I met her wide, panicked eyes. You spent years spending money that wasn't yours. Now you'll have to live without it. My mother let out a choked breath. My father stared at the table, his fingers digging into the wood. Melissa looked like she was about to shatter. I stepped back, adjusting my coat. Dinner's been lovely, I said, my voice light with mock politeness. But I think I've lost my appetite. I pulled out a few bills and dropped them onto the table. This should cover my meal. You'll have to figure out the rest. Then, without another word, I turned and walked toward the door. And for the first time in my life, I left them behind, on my terms. Behind me, I heard the scrape of a chair as someone stood up. Daniel, wait! My mother's voice cracked. I paused, my hand resting on the door handle. I didn't turn around. You can't just walk away from your family like this, she pleaded. We raised you. We gave you everything. I let out a quiet laugh. Everything? Slowly, I turned to face her. Everything? I repeated. You gave her everything. You left me to struggle. I gestured toward Melissa, who stood frozen, gripping the edge of the table like she might collapse. You handed her money, opportunities, a free ride through life, while I had to fight for every step. I shook my head. And now, you expect me to feel guilty for taking back what was mine? My father's voice was cold. You're acting like a child. I met his glare with one of my own. No. I just stopped letting you treat me like one. Melissa finally snapped out of her shock, her face twisting with anger. You think you're better than us? She spat. Fine. Take your stupid business, take the house. I don't need any of it. I arched an eyebrow. Really? Because without my money, your new car is gone. Without the house, you have nowhere to live. Without the business. I smiled. You have nothing. She flinched. For the first time in her life, she had nothing to say. My mother wiped at her eyes. Daniel, we never meant to hurt you. I sighed. Maybe not. But you did. The weight of my words settled over the room like a heavy fog. No one spoke. No one moved. I turned back to the door. Goodbye, Mom. And this time, I walked out for good. I stepped outside, the cool night air hitting me as I let the door shut behind me. My heart was pounding, but I felt something I hadn't in years, free. For so long, I had been the one struggling, watching them live comfortably while I scraped by. I had been the afterthought, the one who never got the praise, the help, the second chances. But tonight? Tonight I took everything back. I walked to my car, gripping my keys tightly. I half expected my father to storm out after me, my mother to beg, or Melissa to throw a tantrum on the front lawn. But they didn't. They were too stunned. Too afraid. They had never imagined this moment, where I wouldn't just stand up for myself, but where I would win. I slid into the driver's seat and took a deep breath. My phone buzzed on the dashboard. A text. From Melissa. Melissa, you're a monster. You ruined everything. I stared at the words for a second, then chuckled. She still doesn't get it. I put my phone on silent and started the engine. The house, my parents, Melissa, they were in the rearview mirror now. And I wasn't looking back. It took a while for the fallout to hit. A week after the dinner, I started hearing things. Melissa had tried to buy something expensive, maybe another shopping spree, maybe some fancy vacation to clear her head. But the transaction failed. Then another. And another. The panic set in. She called the bank, only to be told her access was restricted. She tried using my parents to fix it, but they had no way in. Everything had been put back under my control, and I had no intention of reversing it. The house? She didn't even last a month before realizing that, legally, it wasn't hers. My lawyer sent her the eviction notice. My mother called me that day, frantic. You can't do this, Daniel. She pleaded. She has nowhere to go. I sighed. She had my money for years. What happened to it? Silence. Then she whispered. spend it. I let out a humorless chuckle. Then that sounds like her problem. I hung up. 3 weeks later, my father called. Not to apologize. Not to admit he was wrong. But to demand one last time that I be reasonable. Family takes care of each other, he said, his voice tight. We're your parents. I leaned back in my chair, considering his words. Then, calmly, I asked, Tell me, Dad, when did you ever take care of me? Silence. I nodded. That's what I thought. I ended the call. That was the last time I ever heard from him. Melissa, my parents, they lost everything they had taken from me. The house? Sold. The business? Thriving, under my leadership. The accounts? Locked to them, forever. And me? I had finally taken back what was mine. I had spent my whole life as the second choice, the forgotten son, the one they assumed would always be there to pick up the pieces. But now, they were the ones left with nothing. And I never lost a moment of sleep over it. Months passed, and the silence from my family remained. No calls, no texts, no desperate attempts to reach me anymore. I had expected more resistance, more rage, but I realized something. Once they knew I wasn't going to bend, they had nothing left to say. I wasn't their safety net anymore. Melissa, from what I heard, bounced from friend to friend, burning through whatever goodwill she had left. She tried getting a job, but it didn't last. Real work was never her thing. My parents? They had to downsize, selling off whatever they had left to cover their expenses. Without me footing the bill, they quickly learned how expensive life could be. Did I feel bad? Not even a little. One day, while I was in my office, my assistant knocked on my door. Sir, there's someone here to see you. She says it's personal. I already knew who it was before she even said the name. Melissa. I sighed, leaning back in my chair. Send her in. She walked in hesitantly, nothing like the smug, entitled woman she used to be. She looked different, tired, thinner, her usual designer wardrobe replaced with something far more modest. She sat down across from me, wringing her hands. Daniel. I held up a hand. If you're here for money, don't bother. Her face crumpled, but she didn't argue. I don't need money, she mumbled. I don't know what to do. I studied her for a moment. Figure it out, I said simply. Her eyes watered. You don't get it. I lost everything. I let out a small chuckle. Now you know how it felt. She swallowed hard, looking down at the floor. I was awful to you, wasn't I? I didn't respond right away. I wanted to see if she meant it, or if this was just another performance. Finally I said, Yeah, you were. Her lip trembled, and for the first time in my life, I saw something in her I had never seen before. Regret. She didn't beg. She didn't try to manipulate me. She just sat there, looking lost. After a long pause, she stood up. I won't bother you again, she said quietly. I just needed to say I'm sorry. I watched as she turned to leave, and for a brief moment, I considered stopping her. But I didn't. She needed to learn, just like I had. And as she walked out of my office, I knew, this time, I wasn't the one being left behind. After Melissa left my office, I sat there for a long time, staring at the door she had walked through. I had imagined this moment 1,000 times, her coming back to me, desperate, broken, finally realizing the weight of everything she had done. But in my fantasies, it had always felt more satisfying. Yet now, all I felt was done. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't bitter. I had won, and I knew it. But there was no grand, triumphant moment, no cinematic sense of justice. Just silence. And that was enough. I had spent years waiting for my parents to see me, for Melissa to treat me like an equal, for someone in that family to give me what I had given them, loyalty, effort, love. But the truth was, they were never going to. And I had wasted enough of my life hoping they would. I took a deep breath, then turned back to my desk, my mind already shifting to my next meeting, my next project. This was my life now, my success, my hard work. and I wasn't going to let them take another second of it. I heard bits and pieces about my family over the next year, though none of it came from them directly. Melissa hopped from one job to another, never quite settling. Without a steady stream of money, she struggled, but to her credit, she didn't come back to me again. My parents tried to keep up appearances, pretending everything was fine. But word got around that they had to sell their second car, then the house they had downsized to, until finally, they were renting a small apartment. I was told my mother cried the day they moved. I didn't reach out. I had nothing left to give them. Then, one evening, I got a call. Not from Melissa. Not from my parents. From an old family friend, someone who had watched this whole thing unfold from the sidelines. "I thought you should know," she said hesitantly. "Your father isn't doing well." I said nothing. "He's in the hospital." "Your mom, she asked if I'd call you." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. So now she wanted me to come back? After everything? I closed my eyes, considering it. Then I sighed. "Thanks for letting me know." That was all I said before I hung up. I never called back. And I never went. My father passed 3 months later. I didn't go to the funeral. Melissa tried to call me afterward, maybe thinking grief would be enough to repair the bridge between us. But I didn't answer. Some might call me heartless for that. But after a lifetime of being discarded, after everything they had done, I owed them nothing. They had made their choices. And I had made mine. Years passed. My business thrived. I built my own life, found real friendships, surrounded myself with people who valued me. People who didn't just take and take and take. And one day, when I looked back on everything that had happened, I realized something. I had never really been part of their family.